Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of On Air. Thank you for joining us. I'm delighted to have Mike Hann. Mike is the EVP of Revenue at Fabric, has a fantastic story about growth over the last year or two, which I'll let him delve into a little bit in a moment. Firstly, Mike, thank you for joining us. How are things? You're in London at the moment, I understand.
Yeah, momentarily. Kind of here, there, and everywhere, but it's great to be here, Owen. So thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. See, we met recently at a sales confidence event and absolutely loved hearing your story of going through Series A, B, and C in how many months was it?
13.
13 months. Nuts. And no doubt we'll touch on that in the conversation today. But we're going to focus a little bit on a topic we haven't talked about on the pod before, which is this notion of as you grow as an organization and as a VP, as a sales leader, you've got to start affecting from arm's length. You've got to start thinking about how you affect revenue strategically rather than first line management, being in, rolling your sleeves up, managing individual contributors. And that sort of transition, the challenges along the way and the change in the way that you need to think. And I think it's quite an interesting topic that I know a lot of people will be going through or will be interested to understand for the future. Before we dive into topic though, and learn a bit more, see, there'll be people that know you, Mike, and there's lots of people that won't and may not know Fabric as well. Can you maybe just give us 2 minutes? Who's Mike and who are Fabric?
Yeah, of course. So who's Mike? I've stumbled into e-commerce many years ago now, about 12, 13 years ago, where I was selling office supplies online. So imagine a scene from The Office where I'm effectively like Gareth Keenan or Dwight Schrute, depending on whether you like the US or UK one, but effectively starting my career in e-commerce there. And then soon realized that actually what I liked as an operator within e-commerce was all of the technology. So I loved buying and implementing the tech and seeing like SaaS evolve over time. So kind of rapidly chose that as my focus, and I've been doing e-commerce SaaS for the last 10 years for a company called Channel Advisor, where I started, which went on to IPO, and then founded a company called POC in the mobile app space, ran that for 8 years, and ended up taking that to the US. And then most recently with Fabric, as you said, we've raised just under 300 million in the past 18 months, and it's been a pretty crazy growth story. Company's valued at 1.5 billion now, and we are a challenger in the e-commerce platform space.
Fantastic. So I want to take you back about 18 months for a second. What did obviously this is a fairly big question, so you have to be reasonably concise. What did the day-to-day look like then? So what were you doing? How were you affecting revenue? What were the sort of levers that you were pulling then?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we were around 50 employees at the time, and like very heavy on the engineering side, super talented founding team. We had one account executive, one SDR when I joined. I am pleased to say they're still with the business today, both top performers. So that's been like amazing to see those guys grow and like have them on the journey with me. So huge shout out to Patrick and Blake if they end up listening to this. But the kind of company was very much like founder-led sales. There wasn't much in the way of process and systems, so it was really like trying to productize as much as we can around that. And Fabric has multiple products, which is somewhat unusual for a startup, and we can sell them as individual products as well as like a suite. So there was like lots of complexity to unpack there, and even to this day we're still trying to optimize what that looks like across our different products, because each of them had like different sales motions and have their own challenges day to day. But yeah, that's kind of what the company looked like. And then soon after I joined, as I was speaking to the CEO, I knew we were in the process of closing out a Series A. So it very quickly went into crazy mode in terms of bringing on lots of people very quickly.
So you were in hiring. Were you in deals, bigger deals with reps, all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, every deal really. And I think one of the challenges I have today, and like growing this quickly, is actually I would have loved to have been in more deals for longer.
Yeah.
And I think for folks that are currently in businesses today and are in deals and aspiring to be sales leaders or aspiring to be the next level of sales leader, actually the experience you have seeing all the nuance of your sales cycle is really going to help you as you scale out. And as you like sit through a deal review, you can start to think, oh, that reminds me of XYZ and this happened. And we used, this playbook in this scenario. But yeah, it was probably 6 months or so of being pretty direct in deals, exec sponsoring most deals, before we hired kind of frontline sales managers.
And now, fast track forwards to today, you're managing through managers. If you think back across that 18 months, what have been some of the real sort of changes to the way that you have to think and that you have to just approach the problem? Because I guess you feel further away, you feel like you have to affect in a completely different method, I'm guessing.
Yeah, definitely. And I think being remote also adds to that challenge as well, because you can't even feel the org as much as you could in an office environment, or even like having multiple offices internationally. You can kind of do a few days in each and get a feeling of what's going on and start to influence with, your presence and trying to help people that way. So that's definitely been a challenge. And even now, like we have lots of tools to help with that. And, like we are a Gong customer, but then you've got like a secondary challenge of there's too many Gong calls to listen to lots and lots of calls in a meaningful way. So yeah, definitely a challenge. And I think the way I try to think of it now is being really close with my directs and helping understand what's going on in their world through their lens and influencing that way. And also like trying to, and I touched on this in my talk where we met, around like documenting as much as you can in terms of your expectations, what people should be doing. And I think that's been a learning for me, where typically and where you grow in a slower way than Fabric has. I think sometimes your managers and your reps that have been with you for a while often carry your DNA through. But when you hire so quickly, you end up with like more new reps than experienced reps. So it becomes a bigger challenge to manage.
You've led me right onto my next question. So you started with an SDR and AE 18 months ago, give or take. I know this won't be to the day. And I think we were talking before. I think you said you've got 32 in that sales org now. So that means that 30 of 32 have joined in the last 18 months. So it's a pretty young sales force. The average tenure is fairly short. And there has to be a lack of IP, like you say, that kind of DNA understanding, and therefore you have to find other ways to boost it and to create it. What have been some of the ways that you've ensured that people have adopted that quickly and they've got it and you've been able to shape it across that 18 months?
Yeah, so one of the things I would probably do differently next time around is invest even more in sales ops and sales enablement. And I think we are catching up there, but I think actually if you look back and you have your classic VC model of insert XAE and it spits out XARR.
Yeah.
I think I would really challenge that and say, instead of hiring your 6 AEs, should you look at 5 AEs and somebody in RevOps or somebody in enablement to make those 5 reps even more productive? Because I think all too often we're in this trap of just hiring to a sales capacity plan and not thinking enough about the operations and the support that goes with it. And actually, in doing that, not only are you going to become more effective as a selling organization, your reps are going to be happier because they're going to have more deals and earn more commission.
And if you don't do that, you just end up with more Gong calls to listen to and less time to do it.
Right. And more folks that are untrained and like scrambling to keep up. And then
it's very hard to turn around, isn't it? Because it becomes the DNA and the culture of the org that actually we're okay here when we could be there.
Yeah, and it's a massively overused saying, but like the A players want to work with other A players. So your best talent will be like frustrated if there's a B or a C player, or even like somebody who has potential but is not ramped and not keeping up. Everyone wants to be around great talent.
Yeah. How do you make sure? So you've got your reports that now are first line management. How do you make sure you get a sense of what's changing and evolving in the sales process, in the market, with what your prospects are saying? It must be you're kind of one step removed now, but you still want to stay involved, I guess.
Yeah, and I think actually now I want to be more and more involved, especially in key deals, which just gets harder at scale. But I think it's really like relying on systems and reporting to be able to give you that level of visibility, and knowing what the swing deals are that are really going to help, where like you can add a lot of value into the deal. So we really rely on some of our methodology. So like being really good with Salesforce, being really good with Medic, and then being really good with forecast categories. And we've recently implemented this thing where we have 2 forecast categories within Salesforce, one for the kind of frontline group and then one for the second line group. So an AE might be forecasting something as a kind of as a commit or a banker, but then you might have a different view from your leadership group. So that gives you like a good level of detail, and even to see what are the differences here and why does your rep think it's great and you don't, or vice versa.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because that's the reality of life, is that a rep's view is different to a leader's view, a manager's view is different to a leader's view, and CRM, a business's view. And I think there's a level of honesty and acceptance of that, and therefore you're able to manage with it, rather than living life suffering from fools gladly, thinking actually they've all got to be the same. They're never going to be. It's an interesting concept.
Yeah, and then you've got like what gets reported to the board, and that might be different yet again. So, and again, that's where it becomes really valuable, having that frontline deal experience, because you can say, you can start to recognize those smaller patterns that things like forecasting or deal methodology don't pick up on. It might be, there's a really good fit here because, intrinsically, your product's a great fit for this vertical, and you might not have documented that or have anything in your forecast category that represents that.
And of course, there's been an extra challenge for you, which is that you're hiring a remote team. So you've got people dotted around across different continents, different countries, and you're trying to build a young team, not in age, but in tenure in the organization, in an organization that's growing quickly, changing rapidly, all sorts of challenges. And then add in the fact that you've got time zones, you've got no physical presence with each other. I'm guessing there've been some real challenges on that journey that you can look back on and think, geez, I'm proud to have got past that.
Yeah, and I still think it's a big
getting through it. Maybe is a better way.
Yeah, definitely. And definitely still learning like what the best solution is. And I spoke to one of our board members about this recently, and we've just done a pretty big sales kickoff as like an annual kickoff, got everybody together. And I'm hearing more and more that revenue leaders are doing smaller offsites more often. So effectively, like the quarterly SKO is becoming more of the norm, where it's like, lower production, lower budget, but getting everybody together, getting them rallied around each and every quarter. And that's definitely been effective for us. And even one of the challenges to share as well is, because we were starting from a zero baseline in terms of budget, where we didn't have an office, I think other people I've spoken to where, they were spending X $1,000s a month on rent in an office, they're able to just transfer that budget into offsites. Whereas for us, it's like suddenly very expensive to do 100 grand, 200 grand for an offsite. Just seems very lavish, but actually it's just transitioning an office type environment budget over to an offsite.
It's an interesting perspective. I was talking to somebody yesterday who was saying it's great because we've got the office and we're tied into a lease and we just have to accept it. But similar to you, they've gone from X people to Y people, and the difference is fairly big. They can't fit them all in the office now, so it ends up being completely redundant for them because a third of the team there, so they've got that, and they then have to pay for the offsites as well to get everybody together because they can't fit them in. And it's stuff like that you just don't think about when you're building a team out.
Agree. And one thing we're planning on doing as an experiment, and I'll have to report back on the results here, but we're planning to do like an office week. So to bring everybody together, and it's not an offsite with an agenda, which we've typically done before. It's more, let's all be in an office at the same point in time, get some energy in the room and see what happens that way, and just try and get that like organic team bonding and those like spontaneous moments of grabbing coffee together. So I'm pretty excited about doing that.
You've talked about, and we chatted a bit before, about breaking into the US, breaking into new markets, and how you do that in conjunction with growing out the org, going through 3 rounds of funding. There's a lot to do there. What are some of the things that you look back on for breaking into different territories or breaking into the US, whether it be at Fabric or anywhere else, and you think those are the, if I was doing it again, I know those are my go-to things that I have to do, or maybe some of the things that I just definitely am not going to do again?
Yeah, great question. I think one of the learnings is to treat different segments, and even like, territories definitely, but even segments, if you're trying to break into B2B as a B2C company, if you're trying to break into a new vertical, a new ICP, I think try and think about all of those things as like a new business unit, and all of them should come with a new strategy, a new motion, flexibility in targets and process. That's been a big thing for me as well. I think it's really important to give these people a good level of autonomy so they can lean on HQ and lean on the playbook, but actually still have some freedom to operate within their within the segment that they're going after. So, for the UK, for example, our UK teams are typically meeting face to face and doing business over dinner and drinks more than our US teams. And I think just like subtle differences like that, I think is really important to recognize that markets are different, and just to give the leaders and even like the teams more autonomy to operate in the way that their market does business effectively.
Somebody said to me once about going into new markets that when you forecast out, there's a huge amount of unknown, as you'd expect, and the copy and paste doesn't work, which I think is what you're adhering to there. But their advice to me was plan it, then double it in terms of timeframes and budget you've got to spend on getting it right, and that's probably about right. I don't know if you've experienced that, or you found that you can shortcut it somehow.
I don't like doing that. I think like that's a safe approach. And maybe that's the approach to give to your board, but certainly not to give to your organization. I remember when we were expanding into the US in my previous company, we read all the playbooks around what happens when you break into the US, and it's like don't expect revenue in the first year type thing. And I think if you expect that, you're not going to get any revenue in your first year. So I think as much as possible, try and break the mold and find unnatural ways to build the business. But I don't think settling for like allowing yourself more time to do things is a good approach.
That's a really good point. And you know what? There's other way. Breaking into territories now is very different to what it used to be. It used to be, physically land, you've got to commit to a physical space. Now you can be doing deals, you can be running pipe before you even touch physically in the country.
Right.
And you can kind of go in with that running start, can't you? And I think that gives you a bit of proof of concept before you go and overinvest. So perhaps there's just a different way of looking at it. Perhaps the advice I got is a few years old, to be fair, and the world seems to have changed. And I guess COVID, pandemic, remote has meant that we do transact with other countries a lot more comfortably now anyway.
Or I'm just not very good at managing expectations.
Or is that? Let's hope the board don't listen to this then, for sure.
Yeah. But I think you're right in terms of, generally speaking, people are more inclined to do business with people that are based anywhere, where there was typically like a lot of bias towards big cities. And for us, like where at Fabric today, we're going up against some juggernauts in our space. It's become less about coming into an Adobe office, a Salesforce office, an SAP office versus Fabric in a smaller office, especially back in the day. It's really become about who's delivering the most business value for me versus who's more established in what markets and how big their office is.
Just moving sideways a little bit. So going from two people in the deals, understanding the deals, being involved in moving them through the sales process, to having 32 people across multiple countries, managing through managers. I'm guessing the data that you need to be looking at, the sort of management information that you need to have available has changed and evolved a fair bit, because a lot of it would have been touch and feel, whereas now it's kind of, I'm going through people, so I need the data and I've got to rely on that. What's that journey been like for you?
Full of learnings. But you're right. Like you can manage by touch and feel and knowing every detail in the early days. And actually, like one of the things we really believe in at Fabric, which has come from like a lot of our Amazonian heritage in terms of some of the executive team is really being able to operate at a strategic view and 40,000 foot view, but know every single detail. And there's some like amazing stories with like how Jeff Bezos used to do this that I've kind of come across, and that's been really valuable to me. Is like, your job as a revenue leader is not just to sit in spreadsheets, sit in a Salesforce dashboard. You need to operate at both levels. And then I think one of the learnings we had from going from knowing every deal detail and essentially being in the executive calls or being the executive sponsor is we transitioned too quickly away from not being in the details and just relying on the numbers and the forecast. So now is very much like a blend of being able to dive into the details and making the time to do that. And even from a QBR or a deal review basis is like really understanding those details, because you can then help your frontline managers as well if you notice some trends of, hey, all of your reps aren't doing XYZ with their champion, or they're not covering timescales as well as you expect them to. That's been really important for us. And I think the learning I had there was just relying on numbers and forecast too much. And that was a real challenge with how new the team was, because even if you hire really experienced reps, really experienced managers, they've not had the time in the business to actually understand what are the gotchas in deals, what does it actually mean to forecast, what does a negotiation actually look like. So lots of learnings in terms of how quickly we've grown and transitioned.
I think that's a really interesting point, that notion of staying curious, that your learning was don't get out too early. You need to find ways to transition, but it shouldn't be a one day you're in, one day you're out, 1 month you're in, or 1 quarter. You're kind of always finding ways to dip back in. And I'm curious to just understand what you do now to make sure you get some level of connection with those individual contributors, because I know you're not managing them. I know they don't report to you. I know that you've got to let your managers do their job and do it well, and that's a skill in itself. But I'm guessing there are things that you do to make sure you stay connected to that sort of individual contributor level within your business.
Yeah, and I think we're still experimenting with what the exact recipe is. I think it's a combination of things. I don't think there's like, this is exactly how we do it. I think it's, how do we get some level of visibility on a weekly basis? How do we get visibility on a forecast basis? How do we all stay in communication on a deal review with like the executive team? We use Slack a lot on a per deal basis. That's been really helpful. So if you want to dive in, you can get I think that's the main thing, is if you want to dive in, there's a track record of everything. So from Gong to the Salesforce detail to the medic detail, to the actual communication within Slack and the files that have been sent on. I think that's the main thing, is being able to dive in when you need to, or even when like your frontline managers escalate something. And this happened, yesterday. There was an issue we needed to dive into. And it's just like, how quickly can you get context of a deal, diagnose it, and help it to progress along the way.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's so tempting to think, well, I've got to be up here, I've got to be effective, and you've got to stay connected somehow.
I agree, and honestly, I think that's where ego gets in the way a little bit. And for me included, I just like, oh, I've been a seller for years, I've been a frontline manager for years. It's just like now's the chance to do strategy and stuff. And I think you just need to embrace that. However senior you are, your job is to put runs on the board, and there's no shame in being close to the deals. You're going to get more respect for it, and I think you need to do that at times, or operate at both levels where you can go down into that, but equally, work on strategy as well.
And it sounds like you'd agree with the notion that actually I'd argue that you're better at strategy if you are doing that. If you're in, it can be 10% or 5% or 20%, but
Completely.
being strategic and trying to affect strategically when you've got no notion of what it's like to sell the product today is a real mistake.
Completely, especially when you're still a younger company as well, and things are changing so fast. The more distant you are away from what's going on the ground, the worse leader you're going to become.
Mike, I've got one more question. So crystal ball, 12 months, maybe 18 months. What are the big challenges as you continue to grow the company that you're foreseeing, and the things that you've got coming up that are going to be new for you, new hurdles to jump over?
I think like the continued internationalization is going to be really interesting. So like even the the difference between our West Coast teams and our London teams is already one operational challenge. When you add in Middle Eastern teams, APAC teams, and then try and do some of these things I recommended earlier, like a week in an office or an offsite or like a global all hands call. There's some operational challenges there that are definitely going to be interesting to see. And then I think just the more of the same challenges now are just going to become even more magnified as we scale out bigger teams, where it just becomes harder and harder to kind of coach, mentor, influence as the teams grow.
It's interesting. I lied. I said I had one more. I'm going to ask one more because I know that we talked in the past about, or briefly before, about this notion of lots of US companies coming into Europe, less so the other way around. And I wonder if you could just touch on that as a finishing point around what you've learned from that and what kind of. I know you talked about getting in, understanding their different markets, but kind of what are some of the differences and what are the things that you learned on that journey
of a UK breaking into the US?
Yeah, or just break the other way, because it's often US tech companies coming into Europe, isn't it?
So there's one really good playbook I'd recommend from Octopus Ventures called Question the Questions.
Yeah.
That was like a huge help to me in terms of like the fundamentals of like, how does tax work? How's employment law work? What do I expect when I'm recruiting? All of that stuff, I think, can save like hours of research on like the actual operational side. And then I think connecting with other people that have done it before is hugely powerful. Some of the big learnings for me in doing that were probably around like trying to find what the bridges are and the connections are between what you do in your home markets and the US. So I always like to think of it in terms of like finding a cousin, or like finding a you need to have like something in common, a degree of connection. And we used to have this as like a qualifier of breaking into the US, like what's our degree of connection to that business. So if they're in a vertical that we haven't served before, and we haven't got a reference point in there, and there's no friendly connections from like a personnel point of view, that's going to be really hard to break into. Whereas if we've got a lookalike customer where we've got it in a European market for a US customer, our chances go up dramatically. Or if there's a connection there on a board level or whatever that is, that was a huge thing for us. And then I think the next thing that sticks out to me is really do everything you can for a flagship customer and make them really, really happy. And that continues to be a learning for me today is, oftentimes you're fighting to not negotiate, every 5K of a deal. And actually, I think in your early days, it's much more important to have that brand on board with you and make them as happy as you can.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point to finish on. So finally, who can Fabric help? Who should be talking to Fabric? And what kind of orgs are you talking to and supporting?
Yeah, so we support anyone within the mid-market and enterprise space, and there's lots of traditional solutions that aren't really serving the purpose of like modern e-commerce today. So we would advocate anyone who's looking to modernize their e-commerce stack, or like moving towards a headless or a microservices approach to get in touch with Fabric, because we've got a very unique way of doing things, which is more of a low code view of headless versus a like custom code and like build your own solution. We have lots of different applications you can use. And in our space, Owen, like a lot of times when people think about moving from a Salesforce or an SAP to a new technology stack, they think about doing it all at once. It's like usually a 12 to 24 month project. And we're kind of breaking that down into like a modular basis so you can do it one step at a time, which has been some of the key to our growth that we've seen.
Love it. Mike, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you giving us that time, your time, and some fantastic learnings in there. I'm sure that the listeners and watchers will agree. Thank you ever so much.
Thanks, Owen. Appreciate it.